Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to a brand new format, which we are kind of running out of. We still have plenty of formats to profile, particularly some of the formats after about 2011, 2012, 13, like Dragon Rulers. We haven't really profiled Dragon Ruler decks, and we get plenty of those. Necros still. And then we can go all the way back to some of the early formats. But one of the formats kind of right there in the middle of Yu-Gi-Oh! That we've yet to profile, that I'm really excited to profile, is the format that began in September 2009. So to put this into context, that would be the format after Dark Strike format. So we've actually profiled Dark Strike format quite a bit with Cat Synchro, the original versions of Black Wings. We've also looked at things like Salvo Dad. We'll eventually profile Light Sworns. I am getting much closer to being able to profile Light Sworns. I know typically viewers are used to somewhat of the higher rarity versions, and I'm almost there to being able to profile Light Sworn. A couple more Luminas and we'll be there. But today we're going to take a look at one of the cooler decks from this particular format. What's interesting about this strategy is if you play Edison, which is one of the more popular retro formats, everybody's aware of the Diva-Zombie deck. Diva-Zombie actually began in the format prior in September of 2009. If you didn't play back then, this will be a really exciting profile because all of the cards that make the Diva-Zombie deck popular in the current iteration of Edison were usually semi-limited or in some cases even unlimited, which makes the deck list that we're about to look at today, at least on paper, very powerful. The problem for this particular strategy is that the other big boogeyman in the room was that Light Sworns went completely untouched. Honestly, probably were better after the September 2009 ban list, which is actually crazy to think about. All of the primary strategies from that particular summer format, besides Light Sworns, were hit. Rescue Cat was limited from semi-limited to single-limited, so Cat Synchro decks still existed, but they were severely watered down because Dark Strike Fighter got banned. Black Wings lost 2 of their Gales, which didn't totally new to the deck because the deck was still sort of one of the 3 or 4 top decks into the September format, but it definitely watered it down quite a bit, and then losing Dark Strike Fighter watered that deck down as well. Gladiator Beast was still just a deck on the periphery. It did technically lose a Rescue Cat, but that wasn't an overwhelming limitation in the grand scheme of things, but it was definitely something that deck had to consider in how it wanted to construct its actual monster lineup. Light Sworns, though, the other big deck of the time period, literally didn't see any limitations. Judgment Dragon remained at 2, Charge remained at 3, Lumina was at 3, Honest was at 3, Necrogarden was at 3, all of those power cards were still at 3, and Crush Card Virus, which was its biggest issue in that summer format, was banned. So now you're seeing all of these top tier decks watered down, and one of the best counters to Light Sworns banned, right? Crush Card Virus against Light Sworns has always historically been pretty good because you had Judgment Dragon, Celestia, Lila. The cards you'll primarily lose to, yeah, you can keep cards like Raikou, but if you don't have any of those big monsters like Celestia and Judgment Dragon, you're probably going to lose. Well, that's exactly what Crush Card did. Heading into September, though, that was gone. As a result, your options really were, do you play Light Sworns, basically fully powered up, or do you try to play Black Wings, a little bit watered down, trying to rely on traps, or do you need to play the newly crafted zombie decks? Zombie decks are interesting because there's basically 2 trains of thought. One was to play a version with Krebons and 1 emergency teleport, because teleport was at 1. And then you have an additional target for Allure of Darkness. That was one of the common threads in the format. Or do you try and abuse Deep Sea Diva? And with Deep Sea Diva, if you're familiar with sort of the versions that are popular in Edison, the interaction of Goblin Zombie plus Deep Sea Diva is really powerful. It's even more powerful in this particular format because there is literally 3 Bryanacs and 2 copies of Mizuki, which means when you do that play, where you go Deep Sea Diva with Goblin Zombie on the field, and you summon out a Bryanak with an additional Deep Sea Diva floating on the field, and you search Mizuki off the Goblin Zombie, yes, you can use the Bryanak effect. And this is pre-errata, so you can use it as many times as you want, whenever you want. You then get to search an additional copy of Mizuki when you banish the Mizuki to summon the Goblin Zombie back out of the grave, and then go into another level 6. And then in addition to that, the Bryanak can now discard a second Mizuki from your hand, and then you can banish that again if you want, and it gives a much higher likelihood of OTKing with that combination of cards. As a result, this particular zombie deck, when you combine it with Deep Sea Diva, was really explosive and absolutely gave the Light Sworn strategy a run for its money. And in addition to that, we're going to be looking at a deck where it can play upwards of 3 Burial from the different dimensions, a card that you wouldn't be able to play 3 of in Edison. I've elected to profile a version of the deck that kind of melds together the 2 versions of the deck that top 32'd at the YCS that took place in Los Angeles, the version that Adam Korn brought to the top 4, and a little bit of the version that Claudio Kirchmeier, who I believe is from Austria, if my mind serves me correctly, but the version that Claudio played. Why these decks are different is Claudio played Royal Oppression and multiple copies of Tragodia, an aspect of this strategy that I loved. I'll talk way more about this when I actually get to the deck profile, but Royal Oppression itself is obviously an amazing card. It can be inherently a win condition against a deck like Lightsworns as long as you can protect yourself from Lila and Raikou. But Tragodia gives you this resistance where if you have Royal Oppression up, you can still summon a gigantic monster. And this particular strategy tends to slow the game down. So you can actually just drop a Tragodia with 4 or 5 cards in hand, 6 cards in hand even, and then win with Royal Oppression face up. And sometimes one of the issues of oppression is you flip it, and if your opponent deals with your monsters, all of a sudden now you're locked into your own oppression. Because this deck could actually run 3 Tragodias. I think 2 is a nice middle ground. You can actually still function under Royal Oppression really well with multiple copies of Tragodia. Adam didn't play Royal Oppression, and he played more cards like Wing Blast. He also didn't play the full package of Burial from the Different Dimensions. That was the difference between Claudio and Adam's deck. And I decided to profile the deck with the 3 copies of Burial, because I think that encapsulates a unique aspect of this format. If I just profiled one, it might not differentiate as much from the versions that you may be familiar with if you're playing modern day Edison. As a result, I've kind of melded together 2 versions of the deck, 2 players that I really particularly like their kind of versions of the deck inherently. And by melding them together, I think it encapsulates the format, right? You'll get to see multiple Burials, you'll get to see multiple Mizuki still. I've elected to go with the Deep Sea Diva build, and maybe at some point in time down the line, profile the version with Krebons. I will say, at the beginning of the format, there was that debate, is single emergency teleport and having dark targets worthwhile, or is having a card like Deep Sea Diva and the massive upside worth it? I think the modern day answer to that question is that the Deep Sea Diva version was better. Don't tell the Canadians, I know they loved Krebons. Maybe down the line I'll profile the Krebons version, but the Deep Sea Diva version, when I think of this format, I always call it Diva-Zombie versus Lightsworn format. I don't really consider the Krebons version even remotely as powerful as the Deep Sea Diva version. As a result, today we're going to profile Diva-Zombies, but not in Edison. We're going to profile the September 2009, much more higher upside version of Diva-Zombies.
All right, we'll start the profile off with 2 copies of Kaya. So this deck, because of Goblin Zombie and even cards like Sangan, which technically not all zombie decks selected to play, there's a lot of great tribute fodder for Caius. If you're familiar with the Edison version of this deck, banishing Mizuki, bringing back a Goblin Zombie, tributing for Caius, it's great power play, clears a back row, clears a monster, allows you to regenerate a little bit of card advantage by tutoring out a zombie. This version is going to play 2 copies of Deep Sea Diva. So I'm electing to profile Diva-Zombie, so obviously I'm going to play 2 copies of Deep Sea Diva. There is a version of this deck that plays Krebons. Maybe someday I'll eventually profile it. The actual deck itself is not too different from this one, but it is probably worth talking about, at least at some point, maybe not back-to-back, but I've elected to play 2 copies of Diva. If you're familiar with the version of this deck from Edison, you're familiar with the synergy between Deep Sea Diva, Goblin Zombie, and then Bryanak. In Edison, you only can search 1 copy of Mizuki. In this format, you actually have 2 copies of Mizuki. So this is actually Diva-Zombie at its absolute peak in terms of power. When you use Bryanak, you can discard the Mizuki that you search off the Goblin Zombie, spin something, banish the Mizuki, bring back Goblin Zombie, and then you have Goblin Zombie in the second Deep Sea Diva, and then you can go into whatever level 6 that you happen to want. Bryanak, for example, could be summoned. You can also summon a card like Goyo Guardian, which is legal during this format. And then you actually get to search a second copy of Mizuki, not something that you get to do in Edison. And then you can use Bryanak another time and then discard Mizuki and then bring something back again. So much higher likelihood of actually OTKing with that interaction. Then we have some of the additional zombies. So I elected to play 2 copies of Pyramid Turtle. I elected to play copies of Pyramid Turtle because this deck is going to have Royal Oppression in it, and having ways of slowing down the game can sometimes be beneficial. So I like having multiple copies of Pyramid Turtle. Then we have 2 copies of Goblin Zombie. Obviously, it is included because it's just a critical piece to what this deck is trying to do. Whether it's tutor out Mizuki, banish Mizuki to summon Goblin Zombie to summon Caius, tutor it out even with Goblin Zombie, or rather with Pyramid Turtle if it's absolutely necessary. So 2 copies of Goblin Zombie. This deck is going to play and really utilize for the first time Tragodia. So Tragodia saw popularity in this deck because the format felt somewhat aggressive with decks like Lightsworns, and then even this deck being able to try and OTK with Bryanak, that people elected to play Tragodia. And Tragodia was this really interesting piece where, in order to do that really aggressive play with Bryanak, you would typically have to discard a bunch of cards. Now, granted, a lot of them are sort of pseudo-floaters because you'd get searches off Goblin Zombie, but then you try and do this OTK push, and if you ran into a Tragodia, and all of a sudden your opponent has this gigantic Tragodia on the field because all of their cards were bounced to their hand. So now they have a 3,000, maybe even higher attack Tragodia. They can shift it to attack over Bryanak. Are they really just going to bounce Tragodia back? I mean, they might have to. And all of a sudden, Bryanak doesn't feel like a power play. And then the player that summoned Tragodia can suddenly take advantage of the game going forward. I remember the existence of Tragodia made it very difficult to actually OTK in this format, even though the format felt fairly aggressive. Having multiple copies of Tragodia, and you can go all the way up to 3. I elected a nice middle ground of 2. Gave this deck this interesting defensive strategy where even under something like Royal Oppression, there was always a threat of summoning Tragodia. I've actually talked about historically how I'm not the biggest fan of Tragodia. I actually really like Tragodia in this deck specifically because with cards like Pyramid Turtle, Goblin Zombie, Sangin, Spirit Reaper, Mizuki even, you can play a very passive style, accumulate cards in your hand, prolong the game, and then all of a sudden a card like Tragodia becomes incredible because you're not relying on Tragodia with no traps. You're relying on Tragodia with traps, and it counters the Brian I play really well out of the mirror match. So I really loved including multiple copies of Tragodia. And then some singleton one-of. So we're going to go with Gores to go along with the two Tragodias. This deck has a lot of traps, including continuous lens like Oppression, but against something like Lightsworn, playing Judgment Dragon and blowing up the field, probably made some sense to have a card like Gores in your deck to include with the two Tragodias to give you some resistance on OTKs. A little mini Mystic Tomato package. Now, the interesting thing with Mystic Tomato is besides Sangin, which is the only unique target that only Mystic Tomato can search, the other two of Goblin Zombie and Plague Spreader Zombie can actually be tutored through Pyramid Turtle. But nevertheless, we have a little bit of a mini Mystic Tomato package. Again, I kind of like Mystic Tomato style cards when you have a real oppression in your deck because it can slow the game down. Mystic Tomato wasn't 100% staple. Some version of this deck elected to play 2 copies of Tomato, 0 copies. Not everybody even played Sangin, which might sound crazy. Crush card's not legal, so it's not like there's that obvious blowout card. And this deck already has Goblin Zombie, so Pyramid Turtle seemed a little bit redundant in the eyes of some people when they built this deck, so I can understand cutting Sangin. But I like to play the very defensive strategy that this particular deck allowed you to, and having these cards specifically facilitated that. Reaper makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we're playing a deck with a bunch of zombies. Some of the plays you can make with this deck, though not as likely with this specific version, but some of the versions of this deck, you could Black Rose the field and banish a Mizuki to summon Reaper and attack directly. It's not inconceivable that you can pull that off, particularly with level manipulation from Tragodia. Then, of course, a single copy of Plague Spreader Zombie. That goes without saying, right? This is a zombie deck. This really wouldn't be a deck without Plague Spreader. And then, in order to facilitate some of the zombie combos, we have Zombie Master. For those of you who are familiar with Edison, you're familiar with, obviously, the singleton copy, allowing you to summon back the Plague, allowing you to summon cards from your opponent's graveyard, allowing you to really make some really explosive plays and summon some of the best synchro monsters, like Revive King Hades and Doom Kaiser. And this is a deck with a ton of dark monsters, so we're going to play Dark Arm Dragon, right? Besides some of the earth monsters and the water monsters, this deck is entirely dark, and you can very easily manipulate your graveyard count with dark monsters by using cards like Mizuki, and then even in addition to that, using cards like Burial from a Different Dimension and Book of Life. So this deck has a ton of flexibility in terms of actually getting to 3 darks, whether you see Dark Arm early, middle, or late game. In terms of the spells, so there's a few different versions of this deck. I elected to profile a deck that blends together Adam Korn's deck and Claudio Kirchmeier's deck from the YCS in Los Angeles, the one that Steven Silverman won. Shout out to Steve. I elected to profile a deck that blends the two because I really appreciated both of those players. Those are the 2 players I really liked growing up. And Claudio's deck played 3 Burial, which I think showcases the format a little bit better by actually utilizing 3 copies of this. Adam only elected to play 1. 1 is the amount that you could play in Edison, so I don't think it really showcases this deck if I only profile 1. I want to show the fact that you can actually play up to 3 copies if you wanted to. The primary target with this is obviously Mizuki. You can even put back Plague if necessary. You can do some level manipulation with Allure of Darkness to get Dark Arm Dragon live. So a lot of cool plays with Burial. Claudio elected to play 2 copies of Foolish Burial. This wasn't a staple. It is something that Claudio elected to play. It's not something that Adam elected to play. With this card, you can obviously send Plague, Mizuki, and then you can sometimes send other cards. Sometimes you already have Mizuki in the grave, but you need Goblin Zombie. It's basically never dead because just ditching a Mizuki turns it into sort of a pseudo-monster born-like effect. So I feel like including it's not the end of the world. It's not like one of those cards where, once you see Treeborn Frog or once you see Disc Commander, your Foolish Burial is dead. This deck will basically always have a target in the deck. So we're going to play 2 copies of Foolish Burial, 2 copies of Allure of Darkness. It is limited to 2. And this deck, as we alluded to earlier, has a ton of dark monsters. Plus with Burial, you can actually put some of the monsters back if needed. We have Brain Control and Mind Control. Not much to say about those. We have a deck with Plague Spreader Zombie. You want to level manipulate, which this deck can do with ease. MST and Heavy Storm are at a point where these cards are limited to 1. MST is especially important against opposing royal oppressions and even the Black Whirlwind out of Blackwings. Then we have Book of Moon. You can play more than 1 copy of Book of Moon, depending on which version of the deck you looked at, whether it's Adam's, whether it's Claudio's, or even some of the ones that you could be looking at in some of the later events, like the event that took place in Charlotte not too soon after. You can see a card like Book of Moon played in 2, maybe even a singleton copy here or there. I like just having the 1. I think you could totally justify 2 because it is good against Black Whirlwind, but it's not a card that I'm in love with against Lightsworn. I mean, it's fine against Lightsworns, but a deck like Lightsworns is going to have access to cards like, Arcus can shut it off, and it's not like it's that game-breaking of an effect. It was actually in Nashville, not Charlotte, where the next YCS took place, but it's not as game-breaking as some other cards, so I'm going to like to just only play the singleton copy. Oh, and then the final card is a Book of Life. So you can actually play more than 1 Book of Life. It's an interesting card because in the mirror match, you have to be wary of it, right? You don't want to just leave Mizuki in the graveyard for no reason. You don't even want to necessarily leave zombies in the graveyard for no reason, right? Putting Plague in your graveyard and leaving it there is actually one of the ways you can lose. Because your opponent can just Doom Kaiser or Zombie Master it a bunch of times, and then you end up losing. But it is good against some of the matchups like Lightsworns. You can pick off some of the cards in their graveyard to manipulate their Lightsworn count. It is good in the mirror match to an extent, though, good players typically try to avoid putting zombies in the graveyard if they can avoid it just in general. So it's an interesting card. Claudio elected only to run a singleton copy, so I've elected only to show a singleton copy. Depending on what version of the deck you're looking at, Adam elected to play 2. It's kind of one of those cards where it's either between 1 or 2. It really depends on what version of the deck you're looking at. I elected just to play 1. You can kind of play test yourself and make a decision as to how many that you like. One of the reasons why I think 1 is probably the correct number for this deck is I've elected to play the 2 copies of Royal Oppression in the main deck. Not every version of this deck played Royal Oppression. Adam did not play Royal Oppression. Claudio did. I feel like Oppression is just one of those cards with such a defensive strategy. And not only a defensive strategy, a strategy that can actually play under Royal Oppression really well. Whether it's just summoning Caius a bunch of times or summoning Tragodia, you actually have the ability to make some pretty good power pushes, even though you're locked under Royal Oppression. And if your opponent can't special summon anything and you're having all of these defensive cards in your deck, like Book of Moon and some of the traps that we're going to talk about, you actually can just win the game outright with the Oppression face up, which I think is a huge advantage of this particular deck. And Lightsworns can be a really difficult matchup. So if you're locked them out from using some of their effects, you can end up using Royal Oppression and win the game because your opponent may be locked out of Lila because of your defensive cards, or maybe locked out of Celestia because they can't just put a monster on the field and have it stick. That is, I guess, one of the reasons why Book of Moon can be decent against Lightsworns, is it is one way of just reliably setting Lila. And if you're going to Royal Oppression, maybe that's an interaction that you're interested in. But besides that, we have 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole and talking about ways of dealing with Lila. We're at a point in time where there is priority, so Judgment Dragon will blow up the field if you bottomless it, but it does at least get rid of it. And then against cards like Black Whirlwind, you obviously want to have cards like Bottomless. Same is true with a card like Torrential Tribute, so that they don't get the Black Whirlwind search. Then we have some other singleton one-ups. We have Mirror Force, which, in retrospect, maybe wasn't that great, but it's just at the point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where a lot of people play Mirror Force. We have a single copy of Solemn Judgment to go along with our large trap lineup. This was not a staple in all of these decks. Adam ran it, even though Adam wasn't running Royal Oppression. Claudio didn't. I feel like in a deck with Oppression, you kind of do want to run it. And then a single copy of Trap Dust Shoot. Heavy Storm is legal. Why there's a connection between Trap Dust Shoot and Heavy Storm, I've made this point before, is when Heavy Storm is banned, people typically sit more back row because they don't have to worry about Heavy Storm. As a result, if you draw Dust Shoot going second, sometimes you actually just can't activate it because your opponent set all their hand. With a format with Heavy Storm, all of a sudden people typically will keep a trap or 2 in their hand, and now Trap Dust Shoot's almost always live on the early portion of the game. That is our main deck. Start with the level 5. So this deck between a Sangan and a Spirit Reaper plus Plague can go into level 5, so it's definitely important to have some flexibility there. This might seem a little bit over the top, but we're going to play 3 copies of Bryanak, and it was actually the default to play 3 in Zombies. The interaction that I commented on earlier between Mizuki, Goblin Zombie, and that interaction there with Diva, absolutely crazy. You actually go into 2 Bryanaks all the time, and having a third isn't a bad idea. 1 copy of Goyo Guardian. It's primarily a level 6 base synchro deck, so we're going to have a lot of level 6s. Revive King Hades, absolutely crazy in the mirror match because you can attack over Recruiters, you can attack over Mizuki, anything that activates in the graveyard, you can just attack over it with Revive King. It's really easy to summon this in this strategy, so it's an absolutely essential piece. Basically, any deck that plays Plague plus Zombie Monster should be playing this card. We're going to have 2 copies of Doom Kaiser Dragon. What this card lets you do is when you special summon it, and that includes with Mizuki and Book of Life and other ways, it lets you special summon a zombie from your opponent's graveyard. Why this is so crazy in the mirror match, if your opponent puts Plague in the graveyard, for example, you can punish them by summoning this, bringing back their Plague, and then immediately going into a level 8 synchro. So it has a ton of flexibility there. It's one of those cards where if your opponent makes the mistake of leaving cards in the graveyard that they shouldn't, it creates this snowball effect where you can basically just OTK them because of that mistake. So we're going to play multiple copies of that. In terms of level 7s, Black Rose Dragon, because it's just the best level 7, although you don't go into level 7s all the time. It is possible to combine a level 5 and Plague, and when you play Book of Life, Mizuki, Zombie Master, and other ways of special summoning zombies from the graveyard, you definitely want to have that ability. Plus cards like, let's say you had to use Plague in the first place to summon this, Burial could put the Plague back in the grave and all of a sudden go into level 8. Other powerful level 8s, rather, into level 7. For the level 8s, we have Red Dragon Archfiend and Colossal Fighter. Double Stardust Dragon. This deck's trying to play Royal Oppression and set a bunch of back rows, so you could totally justify playing the 2nd copy of Stardust Dragon. The 15 card that I have here is a little bit controversial because Darkened Dragon was a prize card and it was actually pretty difficult to get. Its requirements are a tuner and then 1 or more non-tuner dark monsters. In this particular strategy, the most common dark monsters that you're going to use is a Revived King Hades, Caius, and then I guess technically Trigodia could potentially get there as well. Why this card is especially good in this strategy is it's really easy to climb into Darkened Dragon with cards like Mizuki. And as a result, you can summon Darkened Dragon probably more reliably than the average strategy. And then if you go Darkened Dragon plus Royal Oppression, it creates this pseudo lock where your opponent doesn't really want to set monsters into that. And then you can continually get card advantage through Darkened Dragon. The thing is, Darkened Dragon was, a couple $1,000, probably around $1,500, which might not seem a lot to modern Yu-Gi-Oh players who think to themselves, oh, I'm paying that much for a set of Starlight rares. I would pay that for a prize card. Yeah, $1,500 was a lot. I mean, we're talking about a time period where Super Bottomless Trap Hole was $40, and it's not even close to that now. $1,500 for a card like this is a lot of money, and it's one of those cards where there weren't even a lot in the market, right? The supply was really low because there just hadn't been a lot of SJCs. So I can understand if you go back to play this format, playing something else. You could play a second Revived King, you could put a Thought Ruler in the deck, you could put Gale in the main deck and put Blackwing Armor Master. That was really common. Adam did that, for example. Only a few decks actually play Darkened Dragon. I can totally understand looking at this and saying, yeah, I'm not going to put a card that was so much money into my extra deck when I go back and play this format. Edison's a little bit different in the sense that the actual Edison event itself released a bunch of them into the supply, and that kind of drove the price down. Darkened Dragon after Edison was about $800, which is still a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but it's about half of where it was, let's say, 3 or 4 months prior. So I can understand how you want to kind of navigate that and make a decision if you go back and play this format. I think this deck at its peak would have played Darkened Dragon. I think the same is true with the Lightsworn strategy. The Lightsworn strategy at this time, virtually all of them played Chaos Sorcerer. You could play multiple Chaos Sorcerers. When you play Chaos Sorcerer, you're also going to play Plague Spreader in Lightsworns as well, and then you can actually access Darkened Dragon. Funny story, I actually borrowed a Darkened Dragon, which is hilarious because I just talked about how nobody had them. But this is actually really funny because I have the map. My buddy had a Darkened Dragon and wasn't going to use it in Lightsworns, and he let me borrow the Darkened Dragon that he could have played in exchange for borrowing this exact Spellground mat at the SJC that took place in Los Angeles that year. So as difficult it was to get, it was not impossible. Shoutouts to Devin Schwartz and Chris Ferber. So in terms of what you would anticipate playing against as we move on to the side deck. So there's not a lot of deck cards here. We've got Mizuki as a representation of the mirror match. We have Lumina. I am on my way to finally being able to profile Lightsworns. I've had this request a lot, and the thing that's holding me back is I did not have Super Luminas. I finally have one Super Lumina, so I'm on my way to eventually being able to profile Lightsworns. People kind of expect to see at least close to high rarity, so I don't think I can profile the deck with common, rare, or even the weird ultra looking one. So I'm on my way. Maybe I can profile the Edison deck soon because I have one Lumina and I already have Secret Judgment Dragons. But there's Lightsworns, which was really the boogeyman. I'm going to put Phantom of Chaos down to represent Twilight, which is the deck that actually won the last SJC of the format. That, in Nashville specifically, that particular deck was really scary because it could play basically all the best Lightsworn cards with all these amazing Chaos monsters, plus even cards like Sky Scourge and Oliris. There were even versions that had the zombie package, so you have Zombie, Lightsworn, Twilight, combining all of the strategies of the format. And I think Blackwing was the most generic anti-meta deck at the time. I could potentially keep putting down strategies, but this format was actually very narrow. It was, in many ways, a 3-deck format, in my opinion, until the very, very end when some of the Twilight strategies kind of broke it apart. So we're going to have a very limited list of potential decks that you could consider playing. In terms of counteracting that, Kaiku was super popular. There's actually a version of this zombie deck that main decked Kaiku. Rodrigo Tagoras, really well-known player at the time, had Kaiku in his main deck. So I actually considered profiling that deck too, but it was not super common to main deck them. But side deck them, it's really good in the mirror match because obviously you can't use Mizuki. It can pick off cards in the graveyard. It can really put your opponent into a little bit of a bind. And the 1800 attack is no joke. We have 2 copies of Legendary Jujutsu Master. I don't have Gladiator to Beast represented here, but Gladiator to Beast can be a bit of an annoying matchup. And if your opponent thinks you have a recruiter set, and what I mean by recruiter, a recruiter or a searcher, what I mean by that is Goblin, Zombie, Saiyan, Pyramid Turtle, or Mystic Tomato, and your opponent thinks they're just going to attack into it and then be able to tag out, and you just run into a Jujutsu Master. Assuming you don't have access to War Chariot, that can be really annoying. Jujutsu Master has always sort of been a nuisance for Gladiator to Beast strategies. Then we have 2 copies of DD Crow, which can line up pretty decent in the mirror match. In this format, as I alluded to, kind of got a little bit explosive by the very end with some of the Twilight strategies. So having a card like DD Crow as a reasonable hand trap's not the worst idea. Lightning Vortex was actually included in some main decks. I decided to put a copy in the side deck. Some people actually mained and sided this card. It's decent when the game devolves into this sort of setting battle back and forth, especially when Royal Oppression is on the field. And you can do this play where you just attack all your opponent's defense position monsters and flip them face up, and then eventually lightning vortex them all away. And yeah, maybe they'll get a Goblin Zombie effect, but maybe you're also killing a Tomato and a Pyramid Turtle. You know, with Oppression, some of the games can slow down a lot, so having a card like Vortex that can break the game apart is not unreasonable. Light Imprisoning Mirror, this is sort of an obvious inclusion because Lightsworns is a really powerful deck. I'll be honest, Lightsworn decks, because of the Twilight cards, had ways of playing around this, which was honestly pretty annoying in retrospect, but having access to this is still really powerful, right? The best cards in that deck are Judgment Dragon and Lila and Celestia. Having Light Imprisoning Mirror is really good. This might seem like a little bit of an unusual inclusion, but 2 copies of Trap Hole. Trap Hole was a pretty common side deck card because it's a good card against Black Whirlwind. You know, as much as I think this format really is centered around Lightsworns and centered around zombie, various versions of zombies, you could technically run into Blackwings every now and again, and Black Whirlwind was at 3. This is a pretty reasonable way early on to just play around Black Whirlwind, before you set a bunch of cards and play into Icarus attack. So between 2 of these, the Book of Moon in the main deck, the Bottomless, Torrential, you actually have some resistance, and then 2 copies of Dust Tornado, which kind of line up well against, like, for example, Blackwing decks, which also very often are going to be playing Royal Oppression, other decks with Royal Oppression, strategies like Glads, or any typical back row deck at the time. So this, I think, is a pretty reasonable side deck representative of what you might anticipate playing. It's actually very similar to the side deck that Claudio built. As I alluded to earlier, this is sort of a blend between, it's actually Claudio's exact, minus a couple cards. He played a card, Malevolent Catastrophe, which is a card I really like, Threatening Roar, which is another pretty good card. I cut those and kind of slimmed it down to a version I think a little bit more representative. He didn't play triple Light Imprisoning Mirror, which is something Adam did, so I kind of melded them together. But I still think it's representative of what you could anticipate seeing by the mid to late stages of the format. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.